Okay, let's unpack this. Because for, 70 years now, we have been using Murphy's Law to complain about just the most mundane stuff.
Right, like your toast landing butterside down.
Exactly. Or getting a flat tire on the one day you forgot your umbrella. We treat it like this pessimistic cosmic joke, right? Like anything that can go wrong will go wrong.
Yeah, like the universe just actively hates you.
Exactly. But the real Edward Murphy, he wasn't like a philosopher complaining about bad luck. He was an aerospace engineer.
Out in the Mojave Desert, yeah.
Right, trying to figure out how to strap a human being to a rocket
Yeah.
traveling 600 miles an hour, slam on the brakes, and, ensure that human didn't die.
Which is a pretty high-stakes environment.
Yeah, exactly. So today, we are taking a sledgehammer to this myth of Murphy's Law. Our mission with this deep dive is to equip you, whether you are, say, a senior systems architect building cloud infrastructure, or a structural engineer, or honestly just someone trying to build a resilient life. We want to give you the definitive blueprint for surviving chaos.
And we are looking at a really fascinating duality in the source material today. Because on one hand, we have the hard mathematical reality of Edward Murphy's engineering principles, how physical and digital systems break down under pressure.
Right, the hardware side of things.
Exactly. But we are pairing that with a completely different text, written by a man who coincidentally shares the exact same last name, Joseph Murphy.
Which is just wild to me. Two Murphys.
Two Murphys. And Joseph Murphy's work, The Law of Belief, explores the architecture of the subconscious mind. So as we do this deep dive, you can kind of picture the visual backdrop shifting from like a blueprint of a stark aerospace testing facility to this serene, subtly lit library.
Oh, I love that imagery.
Right, because we are bridging the gap between designing resilient steel structures and writing the firmware for human reality.
Well, let's start with the steel, because to understand how to build systems that survive, we have to look at the exact origin of things falling apart.
And that takes us to 1949.
Yeah. The Second World War is over, the Cold War is escalating, and the U.S. Air Force is just racing to build these high-altitude, supersonic jets. But there is this massive bottleneck in the engineering process, which is the human body.
You can build a jet that flies at Mach 2, sure.
Right. But if you don't know the precise threshold of physical force a pilot can actually survive during an ejection or a crash, you can't design the cockpit safety systems.
You're flying blind, essentially. So this led to Project MX-981, which was conducted out at Edwards Air Force Base. They basically needed to measure the absolute limits of human tolerance to rapid, violent deceleration.
And their method for doing this was just, it sounds like absolute madness today.
Oh, totally. They built a decelerator sled on a specialized track. They would strap a volunteer in, fire these massive rockets to propel the sled to over 600 miles per hour, and then engage hydraulic brakes to stop the sled in less than 2 seconds.
Less than 2 seconds. And the volunteer, it wasn't a crash test dummy, because dummies can't tell you how their organs feel.
Right. It was a medical doctor named John Paul Stapp.
And he rode that sled 29 times.
29 times. The biomechanics of what Stapp subjected himself to are just horrifying. At his peak, he endured 46 Gs of force.
Wait, 46 Gs? For context, a roller coaster is what, like 3 or 4?
Exactly, over 10 times the force of a roller coaster. When you hit the brakes at that speed, your skeletal structure is restrained by the harness, obviously, but your internal organs, your blood, your brain, they continue moving forward at 600 miles per hour.
Oh my God, just hitting the inside of your own ribcage.
Yes. 46 times the force of gravity is applied to your internal mass. Blood pools in the extremities, capillaries in the eyes burst, ribs crack.
Just a horrific amount of trauma.
Yeah, Stapp suffered concussions, a broken wrist, he temporarily lost his vision. The margin for error was non-existent. A slight structural failure or a calculation error in the braking mechanism wouldn't just invalidate a test, it would tear a human being apart.
Which brings us to Edward Murphy, because his job was to measure those exact forces. And to do this, he designed 16 specific sensors called strain gauges.
And strain gauges are pretty straightforward.
Yeah, the mechanics are relatively simple. They measure mechanical deformation, and they translate that physical stretch or compression into electrical resistance.
So you run a current through it.
Right. You run a current through it, and as the metal bends during that violent stop of the sled, the electrical signal changes. That signal is your data. That's the whole point of the test.
So they set up the sled for this massive test. Stapp is strapped in, the rockets ignite, the sled hits terminal velocity, The hydraulic brakes engage, and the dust settles. Stapp is battered, but he's alive.
The engineers are probably rushing over.
Oh, they sprint to the recording equipment to harvest this incredibly hard-won data. They check the oscillographs, and the readouts are flat.
Just nothing.
0 positive force recorded. The entire experiment yielded nothing.
And the physical sensors didn't shatter, right? Like the wiring didn't snap.
No, the hardware was fine. It turns out the technicians who installed the 16 strain gauges had wired every single one of them backwards.
Oh.
Yeah. They were producing a signal, but it was inverted, reading as negative strain rather than positive force. And standing over this multi-million-dollar failure, Edward Murphy looks at the wiring and says, if there is any way to do it wrong, he will find it.
He meaning the technician.
Right. And this is the moment the historical record just gets totally warped. Murphy was issuing a hyper-specific critique of mechanical design. He was observing that if an engineered system allows a human being to make an error, the human being will inevitably make that error.
But as that phrase leaked out, into the broader aerospace community and then to the press, it completely lost its engineering context. It mutated into this passive, fatalistic proverb. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong.
Exactly. It became about bad luck rather than bad design.
But wait, I have to push back on this.
Yeah.
If a technician wired 16 independent sensors backwards, how is that an engineering design failure? I mean, plugging one cable in upside down, sure, that's an accident. But plugging 16 in upside down? That feels like a statistical miracle. Like if you plug a USB cable in upside down 16 times in a row, that seems like gross negligence by the technician, not a flaw in Murphy's blueprint.
It sounds like it, sure. But you are looking at the sensors as 16 isolated coin flips. Human neurology doesn't work that way, especially in an industrial environment.
What do you mean?
Well, we are talking about technicians working on a sweltering tarmac in the Mojave Desert. They are dealing with intense fatigue and massive pressure from military brass. When humans perform repetitive mechanical tasks under cognitive load, they enter a state of procedural rhythm.
Like going on autopilot.
Exactly. They go on autopilot to conserve mental energy. The design of the connector physically allowed it to be plugged in inverted. So the technician oriented the first one backwards, established that orientation as the baseline procedural muscle memory, and simply replicated the flawed action 15 times without reevaluating.
Oh, wow. So once the first one is wrong, the next 15 are guaranteed to be wrong because the brain just stops checking.
Precisely. So Murphy wasn't cursing the universe. He was realizing that he should have designed a connector with an asymmetric pin layout, a shape that physically refuses to seat into the socket unless it is perfectly aligned.
Like a modern HDMI cable. You physically can't put it in backwards.
Exactly that. True engineering treats human error not as a moral failing or cosmic bad luck, but as a predictable mathematical constant. Failure isn't a cosmic joke, it's just a data point.
I love that. Because the modern interpretation of Murphy's Law breeds helplessness. It suggests chaos is inevitable, so we should just brace for impact and hope for the best.
Right, which is useless. Edward Murphy's original intent demands proactive design. You must anticipate the limits of human cognition and build physical barriers to prevent the inevitable lapse in attention.
And this really moves us from the psychology of the technician right into the hard mathematics of systems architecture. If we look closely at the math presented in our sources, Murphy's Law isn't about luck at all. It is just probability scaling exponentially with complexity.
Absolutely.
And for the students listening, especially if you are learning to build hardware or you're a systems architect or a software engineer, this is the foundational math of why your code breaks.
Let's examine that probability decay in complex systems. Suppose you source a highly premium component for a server rack or, a mechanical engine. And this component has a 99% success rate.
Which sounds great.
It does. In isolation, a 1% chance of failure is negligible. But modern infrastructure does not operate in isolation. You build a subsystem requiring 100 of these premium components to function sequentially.
Right, and the instinct is to think the system as a whole remains 99% reliable because the individual parts are high quality.
But the mathematics of probability dictate that the system's reliability is 8.99 raised to the power of 100. So the chance of all 100 components working flawlessly at the exact same moment drops to roughly 36.6%.
Wait, really? It drops that fast?
Yeah. By integrating highly reliable parts, you have engineered a system with a 63.4% chance of failing. And if you scale that to 1,000 components, which is, by the way, a microscopic number for a modern software application or an electric vehicle, the probability of systemic failure reaches 99.99%.
That is wild. Complexity literally guarantees failure.
Yes.
And it's not just probability, right?
Yeah.
It is the fundamental physics of the universe. The sources bring in the second law of thermodynamics, which is entropy. The baseline state of the universe is chaos. The natural tendency of all matter and energy is to move from a state of order to a state of maximum disorder.
The visual the text uses for this is the transition of water, which I think is perfect.
Yeah.
If you look at liquid water at a molecular level, the H2O molecules are moving rapidly, they're colliding randomly. It is a highly entropic, disordered state. To force those molecules into the rigid, crystalline lattice structure of ice, you have to actively extract heat. You must input continuous electrical energy into a refrigeration unit to maintain that order. The moment you stop inputting energy, the ambient thermal energy of the environment invades the system, breaks the bonds, and the ice melts back into chaos.
It takes constant energy just to maintain the status quo.
Exactly.
This is why bridges rust, why unmaintained code bases accumulate technical debt and just rot. And why a garden turns into weeds if you stop pulling them. The universe is actively trying to dismantle everything we build.
It never stops.
But here's where it gets really interesting for me. If the math guarantees failure, and physics is this constant downward pressure toward chaos, why does anything work at all? Why doesn't the global internet or the power grid just collapse every single afternoon?
Well, they function because millions of engineers, developers, and technicians are constantly injecting energy into those systems to hold back the entropy.
Like keeping the refrigerator plugged in.
Exactly. But when they miss something, we see how fragile the illusion of order really is. We don't just see localized failures, we see cascading failures.
Oh, cascading failures are terrifying.
They are. This is where chaos theory intersects with complex systems. You have the butterfly effect in systems. A small, seemingly contained error shifts the operational load, and because every component is intimately connected to the next, that shifted load breaks the adjacent component. It's a domino effect.
The 2003 Northeast blackout is, like, the textbook autopsy of a cascading failure. Let's walk through exactly how this happens on a physical level, because it illustrates the math of failure perfectly.
Let's do it.
So it's August 2003. It's a massive heat wave across the eastern United States. Everyone has their air conditioning running on maximum, which means the power grid is pulling near record levels of electrical current.
And electricity flowing through high-voltage transmission lines generates heat due to electrical resistance. The higher the current, the hotter the physical metal cable gets.
Makes sense.
When metal heats up, it undergoes thermal expansion. The cables literally stretch and sag closer to the ground. In Ohio, a heavily loaded 345 kilovolt transmission line sags so far that it brushes against the canopy of some untrimmed trees.
Just one overgrown tree.
One tree. The electricity arcs into the tree, creating a short circuit, and the safety relays on that specific line instantly trip, shutting the line down to prevent a fire.
So one line is down. But the millions of air conditioners in Ohio are still demanding power. And the physics of electricity mandate that the current must flow, right? So it immediately reroutes through the path of next least resistance, which is the neighboring transmission lines.
But those neighboring lines were already operating at near maximum capacity because of the heat wave. Suddenly, they are hit with the massive displaced electrical load from the failed line.
Right.
The surge in current causes them to heat up even faster, they sag, they short out, and their safety relays trip.
It's a localized domino effect that rapidly escapes containment.
Very rapidly. Within minutes, this rerouting process spirals completely out of control. As each line fails, an exponentially larger surge of power is forced onto an exponentially shrinking number of active lines. The grid's automated protection systems interpret this massive, wildly fluctuating voltage as a catastrophic threat to the physical generators at the power plants.
The plants themselves start freaking out.
Exactly. To prevent the billion-dollar turbines from literally melting or spinning out of control, the automated fail-safes do exactly what they were programmed to do. They sever the connections.
Plant after plant automatically shuts down just to save itself. And because the system is interconnected all the way to Canada, this wave of darkness sweeps across the map. 55 million people lose power across 8 states in Ontario.
55 million.
Commuters are trapped in subterranean subway cars in New York. Water treatment facilities lose pressure, requiring boil water advisories for millions. Cellular networks collapse as backup batteries drain. A single overgrown tree in Ohio triggered an estimated $6 billion in economic damage.
But here's the thing. The structural engineering was doing what it was designed to do, shutting down to protect the hardware. The failure was in the control room.
The human element.
Yes. Human operators had a window of time to manually isolate the Ohio grid, effectively cutting off the dead limb to save the tree. But the human element failed.
The text highlights the specific cognitive failures that happen in these control rooms. We assume highly trained professionals will act rationally in a crisis, but human neurology degrades rapidly under pressure. First, you have the sheer volume of alarm fatigue.
Oh, alarm fatigue is huge.
The operators were receiving thousands of automated warnings per minute as the grid destabilized. The brain physically cannot process that density of data, so it begins to involuntarily filter information out.
Which leads directly to confirmation bias. The operators were looking at a system they believed was fundamentally robust. When the early warning signs appeared on their screens, their brains actively looked for data to confirm their baseline belief that the grid was stable.
They just saw what they wanted to see.
Exactly. They dismissed the critical warnings as sensor glitches or minor localized issues. They were victims of the illusion of control. If we connect this to the bigger picture, because human beings are emotional, irrational, and inconsistent, any system that relies purely on human perfection is doomed. We build these massive, godlike infrastructure systems, and we assume that because we built them, we command them. We completely underestimate the sheer velocity of entropic collapse.
So if human cognition is fundamentally unreliable under pressure, if fatigue and distraction are guaranteed triggers for cascading failures, and the mathematics of complex systems guarantee that components will eventually break, how do we build anything that lasts? Since we know humans will fail, and math guarantees components will break, how do we survive?
By entirely removing the expectation of human perfection from the design architecture. You contrast human fallibility with rigorous design redundancy, and you counter cognitive failure with automated fail-safes and strict checklists.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of redundancy. We touched on this with the probability math earlier. If one component has a 1% chance of failure, you don't just hope it doesn't fail, you parallel it.
Right. If you run two of those components in parallel and the system only requires one to function to stay online, you fundamentally alter the probability curve.
How so?
Well, the chance of component A failing is 0.1. The chance of component B failing is 0.01. The probability of both independent components failing simultaneously is 0.01 multiplied by 0.01, which is 0.0001, or a 0.01% chance.
Wow. So by adding a single redundant backup, you upgrade your system reliability from 99% to 99.99%?
Exactly. This is why commercial aircraft have multiple engines but can fly on one. It's why hospitals have backup generators. It's why enterprise data centers don't just back up data on the same server rack, they replicate the data to a physically separate geographic location on an entirely different power grid.
So a local hurricane doesn't wipe out the global database?
Right. But you can't just slap endless backups on a system. The sources also warn about the limits of redundancy.
Right, because redundancy introduces its own form of entropy. You have cost, you have weight, and you have systemic failures. If you put 4 backup engines on an airplane, the structural weight requires so much fuel that the plane can barely get off the ground.
And you've introduced 4 new, complex fuel delivery systems that can independently spring leaks or catch fire. At a certain point, the complexity of the backup systems becomes the primary cause of system failure.
Which means redundancy alone isn't enough. You need actionable checklists to mitigate common human errors, like standardizing procedures and automating tasks to remove human intervention. And you need fail-safes.
Yes.
And a fail-safe doesn't prevent a failure, right? It dictates the direction of the failure. Think about the mechanical brakes on an elevator car. If the main hoisting cable snaps, the loss of physical tension on the cable automatically releases heavy, spring-loaded wedges that bite into the guide rails in the elevator shaft.
No computer needs to calculate anything.
Exactly. No human needs to pull a lever. The mechanical failure itself provides the energy to trigger the safety mechanism. The system fails, but it defaults to a safe state, just like nuclear reactor shutoffs dropping control rods by gravity if the power cuts.
Now, for the listeners who are students learning to build resilient software systems, this physical concept translates directly into the architecture of defensive programming.
Oh, let's talk about defensive programming.
It is essentially Edward Murphy's philosophy translated into code. It operates on the core assumption that the environment is hostile, the network is unreliable, and the user is inherently chaotic. You design the software assuming the inputs will be invalid and users will make mistakes.
You expect the user to wire the strain gauges backwards.
Exactly, so you build rigid input validation. If a field asks for a birth date and the user types a paragraph of text or tries to inject an SQL command to delete your database, the system doesn't try to process it and crash. The validation layer rejects the input at the perimeter before it ever touches the core logic.
And furthermore, you implement robust error handling and logging. When a database connection drops, and mathematically it will drop, the application architecture shouldn't freeze or present a raw error stack trace to the user.
Right, it should catch that exception.
Catch it. Log the forensic data silently for the developers, gracefully degrade the user interface, and perhaps serve cached data while continuously attempting to re-establish the connection in the background. Continuous integration is key here too. You have unit testing, integration testing, system testing, user testing. The system bends, but it does not break.
Exactly.
But wait, I look at modern software development, and we have layers upon layers of safety nets. We have automated continuous integration pipelines that run test suites every time someone commits a line of code. We have compilers that catch syntax errors instantly. If developers know they're operating in an environment padded with automated fail-safes, doesn't that fundamentally alter their behavior?
How do you mean?
Well, it's like bowling with the bumpers up. Does adding too many safety nets make developers complacent? Doesn't the safety net actually encourage them to write sloppier code because they know the pipeline will catch the mistake?
That's a great observation. You are identifying the psychological feedback loop of systems design. When you alter an environment to make it safer, humans unconsciously recalibrate their risk tolerance and behave more recklessly, consuming the margin of safety you just engineered.
Wow.
And this is why our sources transition from the hard physics of Murphy's Law into what they call the sister laws of failure. Engineering has Murphy's Law, but business, management, and productivity have their own mathematical laws of failure that interlock with Murphy's. Engineering a resilient system is useless if the team building it collapses under its own organizational dysfunction.
Okay, to see how these sister laws work, let's trace the life cycle of a massive, failed IT project. Because we've all seen these headlines. A government agency or a massive corporation spends 5 years and $1 billion building a new internal platform, and on launch day, it's just a catastrophic, unusable mess.
Oh, it happens constantly.
How does that happen? Well, it starts with the leadership structure, dictated by the Peter Principle, which states, people in a hierarchy rise to their level of incompetence.
Right. So in our hypothetical project, the original architecture was likely designed by a brilliant senior developer. Because this developer was exceptional at writing code and solving logic problems, upper management rewarded them by promoting them to project director.
But the skill set required to architect database schemas has absolutely nothing to do with the skill set required to manage a 100-person team, navigate corporate politics, and allocate budgets.
So the brilliantly competent engineer becomes a highly incompetent manager. They don't know how to delegate, they micromanage the code, and they lose sight of the overall timeline. The leadership is compromised from day one.
And then the development phase is hijacked by the Pareto Principle, commonly known as the 80-20 rule.
The Pareto Principle states that roughly 80% of the effects come from 20% of the causes. Like 80% of bugs come from 20% of the code. In project management, this often manifests as teams spending 80% of their time polishing 20% of the features, usually the flashy, superficial user interface elements, while entirely neglecting the core back-end infrastructure that will actually handle the data load.
They misallocate their resources because the incompetent leadership fails to prioritize effectively.
Exactly.
As the timeline drags, we hit Parkinson's Law. Work expands to fill the time available for its completion. The executives originally gave the team a lavish 2-year timeline to build the platform, and because they had 2 years, the team didn't build a lean, functional prototype.
No, they held endless committee meetings.
Yes, they added unnecessary features to the scope and allowed the architecture to bloat. They burned through 18 months, achieving almost nothing of substance, and now they have to crunch the actual development into the final 6 months.
Which brings us to the most brutal mathematical reality in software development, the 90-90 rule.
Oh, I love the 90-90 rule.
It states, the first 90% of a project takes 90% of the time. The last 10% takes the other 90% of the time.
The math makes zero sense logically, but it is the absolute truth of engineering. You get the basic framework up and running, the buttons click, the screens load, and you think you're almost done. You report to the executives that you are at 90% completion.
But that final 10% is the integration phase. That is where you discover that the payment gateway doesn't communicate with the inventory database, or that the security protocols block the user authentication tokens.
It all falls apart.
The final 10% is where the complex, chaotic reality of interconnected systems actually reveals itself. The cascading failures begin, and the debugging process takes exponentially longer than the initial coding. The project misses its deadline, blows its budget, and launches as a broken mess.
So how does a resilient project manager survive this gauntlet of organizational failure? By doing exactly what the aerospace engineers do. They build redundancy into the project plan itself. They use reserve budgets and buffer time to survive these laws. They pad the budget with unallocated contingency funds to absorb the cost of Parkinson's law.
And they enforce strict agile sprints to combat the Pareto principle, forcing the team to deliver small, working modules rather than saving integration for the very end.
They apply the realism of Edward Murphy to human behavior.
Exactly. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, anticipating systemic and human failure is not a pessimistic worldview. It is a state of profound clarity. This isn't pessimism, it's realism. The resilient engineer and the resilient project manager accept the reality of entropy. They accept that human cognition is fragile. By consenting those hard truths, they gain the power to design physical and organizational structures that can actually withstand the pressure of reality.
Which brings us to the profound pivot in our source material today. We have spent this entire time exploring how to protect physical architecture, code bases, and project timelines from the inevitability of inevitable failure. But now, the sources introduce a completely different Murphy.
Yes, we are opening a completely different text now. We leave the harsh mathematical environment of Edwards Air Force Base, and we transition into the realm of human psychology. We are introduced to Joseph Murphy and his philosophy of the subconscious mind.
And Joseph Murphy introduces a law that seems to completely upend everything we just discussed. He argues that what you expect is exactly what you get.
Joseph Murphy's law of belief is centered on the operational mechanics of the human mind. He proposes a structural division between the conscious mind and the subconscious mind, and he uses this great agricultural metaphor to explain the relationship.
Right.
The conscious mind, the part of you that is currently analyzing our words, the part that applies logic, calculates risk, and worries about the future, is the gardener. The subconscious mind is this vast, impartial ocean or fertile soil.
And the soil is utterly impartial. It doesn't possess the capacity for logical analysis or moral judgment. It is simply a highly fertile generative engine. Joseph Murphy's core thesis is, whatever you impress upon the subconscious must be expressed in your outer world.
If the conscious mind plants seeds of ambition, focus, and abundance, the subconscious will meticulously cultivate those into reality. But if the conscious mind constantly plants seeds of anxiety, fear of failure, and paranoia, the subconscious will accept those instructions just as eagerly, and it will grow a reality of limitation and disaster.
The sources share some amazing historical examples of the subconscious at work, demonstrating that the subconscious operates on a level of synthesis far beyond conscious logic. Consider Thomas Edison.
Oh, the phonograph story.
Yeah. His conscious logical mind was trying to engineer a way to record and reproduce the human voice. He exhausted all conscious analytical avenues and hit a wall. Logic said it couldn't be done, but instead of forcing it, he surrendered the data to his subconscious mind and allowed himself to enter a state of rest. In the stillness of the night, when the conscious gardener was asleep, the subconscious synthesized the solution and presented the complete mechanical blueprint for the cylinder phonograph to his conscious mind.
And the story of the chemist, Auguste Kekulé, is an even clearer example of this mechanism. In the 19th century, chemists were desperately trying to understand the molecular structure of benzene. They knew the chemical formula, but they couldn't map how the atoms were physically arranged. The linear conscious math wasn't working.
So what did he do?
Kekulé works himself into a state of total exhaustion, sits by a fire, and drifts into a semi-conscious state. He begins to see a dream. His subconscious, unburdened by the rigid rules of conscious mathematics, begins communicating through raw visual symbolism.
Because it can't use words.
Right. He sees a vision of atoms forming chains, twisting and turning like snakes, and then one of the snakes reaches around and bites its own tail, forming a spinning circle. Kekulé jolts awake, instantly realizing that the benzene molecule is not a linear chain, but a closed hexagonal ring.
The conscious mind couldn't solve the geometry, so the subconscious bypassed logic and provided the answer through a dream. It is a phenomenal demonstration of cognitive power. But wait, so what does this all mean? We have a massive, seemingly irreconcilable contradiction here between our two sources.
Let's lay the contradiction out.
We just spent 40 minutes analyzing Edward Murphy's doctrine. You must constantly anticipate failure. You have to look at the power grid and meticulously imagine every single way it could collapse. You are required to focus on disaster to build fail-safes. But now, Joseph Murphy steps in and says, worry is a negative prayer. He argues that if you imagine disaster, your impartial subconscious will accept that vision as a directive, and it will actively manifest that exact catastrophic failure into your reality. How can you be a defensive programmer without manifesting disaster?
It is the central paradox of the material.
Yeah.
But it resolves brilliantly when you delineate the boundaries of action versus emotion. Edward's law is about taking action on physical design, what you can control. Joseph's law is about managing your internal emotional state, letting go of the illusion of control over what you can't.
Walk me through that separation.
A great engineer looks at a complex system and rationally calculates the vectors of failure. They recognize that a power surge could destroy the database. That is conscious, logical analysis. They then take physical action, they write the exception handling code, and they install the physical surge protectors. They have altered the external environment. Edward Murphy's law has been satisfied. But here is the critical pivot. Once the physical failsafe is built, the engineer does not carry the emotional terror of the database collapsing into their internal life.
They separate the action from the anxiety.
Precisely. A great engineer builds a redundant system so that they don't have to worry. They use the physical engineering to purchase psychological security. Because they've done the hard defensive work in the material world, their conscious mind feels safe. It relaxes its guard. And that relaxation allows the engineer to utilize Joseph Murphy's law, feeding the subconscious mind with expectations of success, stability, and peace.
Wow.
You engineer the physical world for the worst-case scenario, specifically so that you have the psychological freedom to program your mind for the best-case scenario.
That distinction changes everything. Because Joseph Murphy's philosophy isn't just about manifesting success. He describes the subconscious mind as its own internal failsafe. Just as structural engineers build mechanical brakes into an elevator, human evolution has built a biological and spiritual failsafe into our neurology that operates far below our conscious awareness.
The sources refer to the subconscious as the unseen eye and ear, because it perceives a vaster field than the conscious five senses. The conscious mind can only focus on a tiny fraction of the sensory data in your immediate environment. But the subconscious is a massive parallel processor. It is constantly absorbing millions of data points, subtle changes in room temperature, peripheral movements, shifts in tone of voice data that the conscious mind entirely filters out.
The sources provide vivid examples of this internal radar triggering. There's a story of a mother who's been awake for days caring for a sick child. She finally collapses into a deep sleep out of pure physiological exhaustion. But her subconscious remains on active watch.
The unseen ear.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is monitoring the subtle rhythm of her child's breathing across the room. When the breathing pattern shifts even slightly, indicating a need for medication, her subconscious overrides her physical exhaustion and jolts her awake at the exact required moment. No alarm clock, just biological telemetry.
Or consider the example from the source of the businessman in a high-stakes negotiation. He is sitting across the table from a potential partner. The conscious data, the financial documents, the legal contracts all indicate that the deal is incredibly lucrative. His logical conscious mind says, sign the contract. But suddenly, he feels a tightening in his chest. His stomach drops. He feels a profound sense of unease. He walks away from the deal and months later discovers the partner was running an elaborate fraud.
What happened mechanically in that boardroom?
While his conscious mind was reading the contract, his subconscious was reading the person across the table. It detected microscopic muscular twitches around the person's eyes, a slight vocal tremor, a discrepancy in their body language that indicated deception.
Stuff you can't even consciously register.
Exactly. The subconscious processed this massive data set instantly, recognized the pattern of a threat, and because it couldn't communicate through a logical spreadsheet, it communicated through the autonomic nervous system. It triggered a physical stress response to force the conscious mind to halt. It was a biological failsafe engaging.
There's also the story of the woman dreaming of a black box behind a picture frame to find hidden money. The subconscious just knows things the conscious mind misses. But the sources suggest we shouldn't just wait passively for the subconscious to scream at us in a crisis. We can actively program it. The challenge is, how do you actually write code to your own subconscious? If the conscious mind is the gardener standing guard, how do you bypass it to plant a new seed?
The text highlights a very specific physiological window for this programming, and it discusses the power of drowsiness. The twilight state between waking and sleeping is the best time to program this failsafe, because the conscious guard relaxes.
Okay, let's translate this into an engineering analogy. If you have a smartphone that is locked down by the manufacturer, you can't easily change the core operating system. The user interface prevents it. But if you plug that phone into a computer and reboot it in developer mode, you bypass the user interface entirely. You gain root access to the hardware, and you can flash entirely new firmware directly to the motherboard. The twilight state before sleep is putting your brain into developer mode, where you can flash new firmware directly to your internal hardware without the conscious mind's firewall blocking it.
That is exactly what is happening neurologically. In a fully waking state, your conscious mind is highly analytical and defensive. If you attempt to program a new belief, your conscious mind immediately acts as a firewall and rejects the new programming as mathematically improbable. The seed bounces off the hardened soil.
But as you enter that drowsy twilight state, the conscious firewall powers down. The analytical guard falls asleep. But the subconscious remains completely online, the soil is open, and you have root access.
Once you have access, Joseph Murphy outlines the specific syntax required to write the new firmware. He calls it the 21-day challenge. But the methodology is counterintuitive. You don't beg or plead for what you want. Pleading fundamentally programs the subconscious with the reality of lack.
The syntax is, assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled.
Yes. You must generate the precise emotional resonance of the completed goal. The subconscious mind does not process language or logic. It processes imagery and emotion. It accepts the emotional state as objective reality. So if you want a promotion, you visualize the exact moment after you get the job. You feel the physical weight of the new office keys in your hand. You lock onto that highly specific, synthesized emotion of victory, and you allow yourself to drift into unconsciousness while holding that feeling.
When you repeat this process consistently, the subconscious accepts this emotional state as the new baseline reality. And it goes to work aligning your external world with your internal programming. Which brings us to the final and perhaps most vital application of this internal programming, everyday life, specifically regarding wealth and abundance, and ultimately how we unite these two Murphys.
Joseph Murphy's view on wealth is a radical departure from the norm. He uses a physiological metaphor. Money is like blood, it must circulate. For a biological organism to remain healthy, blood must circulate continuously. If you hoard money in a state of terror, constantly fearing economic collapse, you are applying a tourniquet to an artery.
And tissue undergoes necrosis and dies.
Exactly. Wealth must circulate. Furthermore, the text is brutal about envy. Envy is planting seeds of lack. We walk around saying things like, money is evil, or I never have enough.
And we don't realize that the subconscious mind is listening to every word and absorbing every emotion.
If you consciously declare that money is evil, or if you generate feelings of resentment and envy, you are issuing a direct command to your subconscious. The subconscious obeys and keeps wealth away. It ensures that you remain safely separated from the prosperity you claim to hate. Envy is the act of planting weeds in your own soil.
So how do we apply this internal programming to everyday life? How do we unite the engineer and the gardener?
This raises an important question, right? How do we live daily? The answer is found in a brilliant corollary buried in the Edward Murphy engineering texts regarding optimism, pessimism, and realism.
The optimism-pessimism corollary.
Yes, it states, optimism is the belief that everything will work out perfectly. Pessimism is the belief that everything will go wrong. Realism is the understanding that both are wrong.
Blind optimism is dangerous. If you are a blind optimist running a power grid, you don't build backup generators because you assume the sunny weather will hold. When the storm hits, people get hurt.
Conversely, blind pessimism is equally destructive. The pessimist assumes the storm will destroy everything, regardless of what they do, and their chronic focus on disaster actively programs their subconscious to seek out and manifest that very ruin.
So we live as realists.
We live as realists. We consciously accept that the world is chaotic and unpredictable, thanks to entropy. We accept the brutal facts of physics. Because we accept this reality, we build strong, redundant systems in our work and lives, satisfying Edward Murphy.
We build an armored fortress in the physical world.
But the moment the physical work is complete, the realist pivots entirely. Because the fortress is built, the conscious mind's demand for security has been answered. And because we have prepared, we can go to sleep at night, feeding our subconscious with peace, faith, and the expectation of abundance, satisfying Joseph Murphy.
You ruthlessly engineer your physical reality for the worst-case scenario, specifically so that you have the freedom to program your mental reality for the best-case scenario. What an incredible journey for you, the listener, today. We started on the 600-mile park rock sleds of 1949 and the math of catastrophic failure, examining how cascading failures bring down power grids and how structural engineers fight back with redundancy and fail-safes. We navigated the corporate dysfunction of the Peter Principle. And then we stepped out of the server room and into the quiet, fertile soil of the subconscious mind. You now have the ultimate blueprint. Engineer your life for the worst, but program your mind for the best.
You know how to construct the physical barriers against entropy, and you know how to flash new, prosperous firmware directly into your own operating system.
There is one final provocative thought from the source material that I want to leave you with, something for you to mull over on your own tonight. The source notes that the universe is not a machine. It is a weather system. You can't predict a weather system, but you can build a house that withstands a hurricane. And here's something to think about. What if the very act of building a resilient, fail-safe system in the physical world is the exact psychological trigger your subconscious needs to finally stop worrying and start manifesting the life you actually want? What if locking the doors and checking the backups is the only way to convince your anxious conscious mind to finally let go?
The walls of the fortress are not built to keep the world out. They are built so the king inside can sleep in peace.
Precisely. So the next time your phone slips into a puddle or you get a flat tire, don't assume the universe is targeting you. Fix the tire, reboot the system, and know that the code running in your subconscious is far more powerful than a little localized chaos.